you would think, and you'd be right to some degree, that, Tennessee, leads the nation with an absurd, like 36 plays of 30 yards or longer. Well, Georgia doesn't really do that. But what Georgia does, as well as anybody, is they get 10-yard plays. So they get chunks. Their chunks are just smaller. They don't hit home runs like Tennessee, but they hit a heck of a lot of doubles. And so I think if they can run it with that plethora of backs, and we saw, Dejon Edwards was really good against Florida. Whichever running back they go to, I think if they can run it, use the wide receivers from time to time, and then continue to feed Bowers in Washington, I think they can control the ball, beat them up a little bit, and then give their defense a little confidence that, hey, if we can force them into one mistake, and then what kind of chances will Kirby take, especially without Nolan Smith, to try to get some heat on Hendon Hooker? Because there's been no blueprint to stop them. But the team that probably did best was Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh blitzes from about the time you walk out of the locker room. So that's not necessarily in Kirby and, Will Muschamp and, Schumann, all the guys on that staff. It's not really what they do all the time. But will they break it up a little bit and try to heat up Hooker and see if they can force him into making some mistakes that he hasn't made all year? So that's the thing to me. I think they can run it. I think they will run it at home. I think they'll control the ball and be very effective on offense. And the thing I want to see on the other side is, how much does Georgia send the house and say, you know what, make the throw and make it now, and then see if they can trust their guys to stay with them long enough?
So I had a defensive coach tell me that he really thought it was an advantage that Georgia's going to go second here defensively because their system is so similar to Saban's system.
It's funny. Pollock doesn't agree with that. He doesn't think it's that similar. He thinks there are a lot of distinct differences.
So they've evolved, and including with simulated pressures last year with Lanning. But at the very fundamental base of it, there's an understanding of Bama and what they were trying to do and what worked and what didn't. Now, I'm obviously not as X's and O's savvy as David, so I certainly don't want to be disagreeing with him. But I do think fundamentally you can learn a lot when you can understand the wiring and structure of a defense and the intent of a defense and what worked and what didn't. So Alabama played them very passively. They dropped 8 a ton. They dropped Will Anderson into coverage quite a bit, according to this coach who I talked to who studied it. And that was not a good plan. I really think that the loss of Nolan Smith is going to be a crushing personnel loss for Georgia in this game. Now, Jalen Carter coming back is a huge addition. He only played about 20 snaps against Florida, but boy, was he impactful. And I think he only had like 1 tackle, but that doesn't matter. If you can just completely annihilate the pocket and be disruptive from the interior, and going into the season, to me, Jalen Carter was the single best defensive lineman in the country and maybe the single best football player in the country. So there's just going to be more onus on him to play more snaps coming off the MCL injury against Missouri. And he is going to have to be a conscientious disruptor, because I don't think without Smith, Georgia really has the type of guys on the edge who can get to the quarterback. So where Tennessee, we're going to pick the games on Friday, obviously, where Tennessee has the biggest advantage here is Georgia's corners outside of Kelee Ringo are pedestrian. And there's some people I talk to who don't even think Kelee Ringo is like a first round pick good. They think he's they think he's good. He's height, weight, speed. He's going to get drafted high, but they don't think his performance maybe matches his reputation. And then when you go opposite him and you go to Lassiter, and then behind Lassiter, you have a lot of young, inexperienced players. And if there's one thing that Heupel and Alex Golesh have shown they can do, is find the weakness and pound the weakness. And that is distinctly where Georgia's defense is weak right now. A couple of people said they thought it would be helpful to Tennessee that Kent actually moved the ball decent against Georgia. Now, again, Kent wasn't going to beat Georgia. Kent did not run the normal tempo they run. So Kent State, I should say this, Kent State runs a similar Baylor-ish style of offense. And again, they don't have the same athletes, they don't have the same quarterback, but they do at least have a similar sort of unconventional system. Georgia particularly struggled with exotic formations. So there's a little blueprint, like just like we said, Georgia had a defensive blueprint perhaps to follow or not follow from Alabama. I think Tennessee's blueprint is going to come through what worked and what didn't for Kent. But there is the coaches I talked to, Rece, there's a lot of optimism that Tennessee is going to be able to move the ball effectively and win the game.
I think they're going to score. This is one of those things where in the old days, a good defensive performance, you couldn't fathom a good defensive performance being holding someone to 31 points, say. If Georgia can hold them to 31 points, that's a really good day at the office. And then the question becomes, can you put more than that on the board? I would suspect to win the game, Georgia's going to need to score 40 points, which that's not foreign to them. They're top 10 in the country in offense and scoring offense. It's not like they don't score. You follow the recruiting really, really closely. With Nolan Smith being out, is this the unveiling of Marvin Jones, the freshman? He's a little bit farther down the depth chart. Would you see someone unexpected? Have you heard of anyone?
I think we'll see some Marvin Jones. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And again, some of it's going to be situationally, and then what can you actually do things situationally with the tempo. But I think Marvin Jones Jr., the true freshman, we will see some of in this game. Along with Marvin Jones Jr., I think Chaz Chambliss, who played a bunch against Florida and played pretty well, I think he's going to get a lot more snaps, and they're going to have to rely on him more. He'd had a bit of a gummy hamstring, so his health and his ability to play full snaps are going to be interesting. He's obviously a backup there now. He's a sophomore, so look, like it's an interesting test of the recruiting machine, right? You can bring in all these 5 stars. How ready are they going to be under the duress, and how ready are they going to be to adjust to the speed and the tempo too? If you haven't played a ton of snaps this year, there's no way to really prepare yourself for the football game snaps that you're going to play against Tennessee. I don't care how many conditioning runs you do. I don't care how hard you work in the weight room. That's a different deal. So it'll be really interesting with some guys who played lighter snaps to see how they can go in and hold up under that tempo. And you're going to have to play a lot of guys, and that's why it'll be interesting to see when you look at their secondary. When you have Tyke Smith, who's a transfer, is going to get more snaps.
They've been waiting on him too. He missed almost all last year with injury, but he was a really good player at West Virginia, and a guy who's been around and seen a lot of fast offenses in his in his days too.
Sure. Dalen Everett, the freshman, these guys are going to get rotated in 6 and 23, and Tennessee's going to find them, and they are going to they're gonna do that. Now I've knocked Georgia secondary a little bit. Coaches rave about Malachi Starks, the true freshman free safety who's been starting for them. They really feel like he is an elite player, who's going to just kind of be one of those next creatures to come out of Georgia and be a 3 and done in a first round pick. He is clearly one of those special guys that's just a different cat. So all that said, he's still a freshman. It'll be interesting to see when he's put under duress this weekend how he responds.
It's really interesting to me. There are obvious parallels between this Tennessee team and 2019 LSU team. You've got an old quarterback. You've got a boatload of dangerous receivers. You've got sort of coming out of nowhere, surviving an early game on the road against an opponent who turned out not to be as good as people thought in the preseason. For LSU, it was Texas. For Tennessee, it was Pittsburgh. You get a marquee win, and now the real test is beating a juggernaut in their place in November. so much of this has been because we're so offensive centric in college football now is what in the world is Georgia going to do with Tennessee? I'm almost getting some vibes here. As much as I do buy into that there are parallels and valid comparisons between 2019 LSU and 2022 Tennessee, I'm starting to get a little bit of poor old Georgia. What in the world's Georgia going to do? And I think that that's going to help them from an emotional standpoint. And I also think there's a little bit of we've kind of forgotten about Georgia. And this is what you do to champions and teams who have won something. You start picking at the flaws rather than appreciating the strengths. They can't do this, they can't do that. Well, that I think Georgia is the most underappreciated defending national champion that's still undefeated that we've had in recent memory. Now, a lot of that's schedule. A lot of that's because they stumbled around against Kent State and Missouri because they were somewhat disinterested. Schedule hasn't done them any favors because their SEC opponents haven't been very good. This is a real opportunity for Georgia, too. Not just to stop the Tennessee juggernaut. It's an opportunity for Georgia to go, hey, we're a standard bearer here. You have to measure up to us. And it's also a test to see if Georgia is that. Now, Georgia's not going anywhere if it loses the game. I mean, they'll be back next year and the year after that and all years you can see in the foreseeable future. But at least for this season, as it's defined, this is a pretty huge moment for Georgia. It's easy to make it about Tennessee because they're the bright, shiny new toy and they're number one, highest ranking they've ever had. Georgia has an opportunity here, too, to sort of throw down a gauntlet and remind everybody who they are.
Yeah, I think, Rece, it's a great point. And Georgia is still an 8-point favorite right now. And Georgia has built.
Oh, how can that be? Oh, poor old Georgia.
Yeah, they built the best mousetrap outside of Tuscaloosa right now. And again, you play in these big games, and it's a test of that depth. One of the interesting things some of the coaches I talked to this week said was they felt Georgia played harder than Alabama. They felt Georgia was more dialed into their scheme than Alabama. They maybe did a little bit less, but because they did less, they did it a little bit better. They really felt like through all three phases, they were threaded together better. And look, Georgia's ridiculously talented. We're certainly not, we're certainly not sitting here undercutting what's been built there and the talent that's there. We've had a lot of conversation and not really talked about the development of Stetson Bennett, which I think has really been the key to letting this younger Georgia team come along, is that Stetson Bennett has been the best version of Stetson Bennett we've seen this year. It's essentially national title game Stetson Bennett, who has played through a majority of this season. They've loosened up the playbook for him a little bit. He's a threat with his legs. He's accurate. Do I think Stetson Bennett gets drafted in the NFL? We'll have 3 months to, discuss that after the season ends. Probably not. Do I think Stetson Bennett can be an elite, iconic college quarterback? Yes. And I think he is that, and he has become that. And then you have Broderick Jones, the left tackle, who will be a high pick in the draft. You have the best center in the country in many people's names, Cedric Von Prawn. And then you have generally an offensive line with Warren McClendon at right tackle that is viewed as one of the highest end in the SEC. So they are both protecting Bennett, giving him some time to let it rip, which he's done a little bit more this year. And you're also opening up holes for that sort of cadre of tailbacks. One last point from some of the defensive coaches who played Georgia this year, Rece. I just wrote this yesterday too. 3, 2, 1. When you talk to the defensive coaches who played Georgia this year, they really give a lot of credit to Todd Monken in the way he calls plays. And this is something that's unquantifiable, even in analytics. They're like plays you watch and study. When they play you, they become different plays. Like they really thought he just broke tendencies and just kept a nice balance and a rhythm and a cadence. And again, you don't have Trevor Lawrence at quarterback. You have Stetson Bennett at quarterback. So he is he has evolved, developed, accommodated for that, really used the tight ends in creative ways. Now, I noticed Eric Gilbert did not play against Florida. He has sort of popped up a few times, and obviously, he's a extremely talented tight end who's gone through some significant personal struggles, and that's kind of been just a little bit of an ordeal there with Georgia trying to get him ready to get on the field. So I don't know if we'll see him as their third tight end at all. My guess would be no, if he didn't play, but I don't know that. But I do think that is just like, oh, by the way, here's this, highly regarded player who is just sort of not really impacting the program in a significant way who's there. So yeah, give Monken a lot of credit that he got the best compliments that I find are when you're not looking for them. And people volunteered and brought up Monken and the job he did distributing, rhythm, keeping defenses off balance, etc.
I know he's not the prototype. I spent a bunch of time on this podcast or a similar one last year touting Stetson Bennett. He's good. Everybody needs to accept it. He's really good. And the only thing that's going to keep him from getting drafted is probably that he's not the biggest guy in the world. And even as big a Stetson Bennett supporter as I am, there are some moments where his sort of whirling dervish gunslinger, don't give a crap attitude, and I mean that in a good way, meaning that he's fearless about the consequences, can occasionally get him in trouble. And so you're going to have one or two of those plays a game, and he'll need to temper that Saturday without tempering what makes him really good. And that's the fact that he'll turn it loose. I love that about him, man. He'll throw the football and he'll take off running, and he's a baller.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.